All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, as the name suggests, into the world of GSK.
GSK,
GSK,
yeah.
one of the big players in the global biopharma scene. We're talking specialty medicines, vaccines, general medicines, all with a big focus on the immune system and, of course, all the advanced technologies that come into play these days.
Cutting edge stuff.
Cutting edge stuff for sure. So for this deep dive, we're going to try to really understand how GSK's business breaks down, how they did financially in 2024, and where they seem to be headed based on their latest annual report.
Right, the big picture.
Yeah, the big picture. And just to give you a flavor of their overall approach right from the start, GSK actually uses something called a responsible business performance rating, which is kind of interesting. It covers 6 key areas.
6 areas.
Yeah, and these are like, access to medicines globally, global health and health security, of course, the environment, inclusion and diversity.
Yeah.
And you've got ethical standards and making sure their products are well governed.
A lot to cover.
A lot to cover, for sure. But the impressive thing is that in 2024, they said they actually hit or even surpassed 91% of the targets they set for themselves in those areas.
That's a pretty high bar.
It is a pretty high bar, yeah. So let's kind of dig into the core of their business, like how it all actually works.
Right. Let's get into the nuts and bolts.
Nuts and bolts.
So GSK's got this strategy. They call it ahead together.
Ahead together.
Yeah, it's all built on 3 main pillars: innovation, performance, and trust.
Okay, so those are kind of their guiding principles.
Yeah, you can think of it as their response to all the big changes happening in healthcare right now.
Right, because things are changing so fast.
Rapidly, yeah.
So let's start with innovation. I mean, that's kind of the heart of any biopharma company, right? And their research and development, it seems really sophisticated. They're not just looking at the immune system. Generally, they're getting into like the nitty-gritty of human genetics, even single-cell profiling. And then on top of that, they're using AI and machine learning.
Right, they're really embracing these new technologies.
Yeah, and it seems like they're using them in some really interesting ways, not just to find new drugs, but to figure out who's actually going to benefit most from those drugs.
Exactly. It's about making treatment more precise, more personalized.
More personalized, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're also teaming up with some big names in academia, like Cambridge, Boston, and Oxford University.
Powerhouses.
Powerhouses, yeah. And that's for research on all kinds of stuff: kidney and lung diseases, regenerative medicine, even preventing cancer with vaccines.
Wow.
It's a lot. And it seems like all this focus on innovation is really paying off, especially in certain areas. Like their oncology business, for example, their sales almost doubled.
Doubled.
Yeah, to over 1.4 billion pounds.
That's huge.
Huge, right?
Yeah.
And that growth in oncology is not just from one drug. It's coming from a bunch of different specialty medicines, particularly for ovarian and endometrial cancers. And then there's Ojara, that's for people with myelofibrosis, a type of bone marrow cancer who also have anemia.
Right.
So it seems like their targeted therapies are making a real difference.
Definitely seems that way.
Then you've got their HIV division also doing really well. Sales up 13%.
Not bad.
Not bad at all. And what's interesting here is that 20% of those sales are coming from those newer, long-acting injectable treatments and prevention options.
Wow.
Pre-FP, pre-exposure prophylaxis.
Right, a big shift towards injectables.
A big shift, yeah. And that could be really important for, making sure people stick with their treatment.
Definitely. And pre-PP has really changed the game when it comes to HIV prevention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk respiratory and immunology. They've had some positive news there, too, right?
Yeah, some promising stuff. They had those positive results from the phase 3 matinee trial for mepolizumab. That's for COPD.
COPD.
Yeah, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease.
Right, a big one.
Yeah, and those results were good enough that they've applied for approval in the U.S. And then there's lenirixabat for cholestatic pruritus. That's a condition that causes really severe itching, and they've got positive phase 3 results there, too.
So potentially some relief on the horizon for those patients.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Now, vaccines, that's a bit of a different story, right?
A bit more complicated.
They saw a 3% dip in overall vaccine sales.
A dip.
A dip, yeah.
Interesting.
They're saying it's because some external pressures in the U.S. and China, specifically for Shingrix, their shingles vaccine, and Arexvy, their RSV vaccine.
Right.
But they do seem confident that they'll bounce back and see long-term growth in vaccines.
Okay, so not panicking.
No, not panicking. And I guess it makes sense. External factors can really shake things up, even in established markets like vaccines.
For sure.
But looking ahead, they did get approval in the U.S. for Penmenvy, their 5-in-1 vaccine against meningococcal disease, and that was in February 2025, so just after the period this report covers. So that's a good sign. Plus, they've got some good data on giving their RSV and shingles vaccines at the same time as flu shots.
That's convenient.
Yeah, one less trip to the doctor.
Exactly.
Speaking of convenience and efficiency, we were talking about how they're using AI and machine learning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty remarkable how they're using those tools to figure out which patients are most likely to respond well to specific treatments.
Yeah, that's the holy grail in a lot of ways.
It is, yeah. And they specifically mentioned piroversin for hepatitis B and the DMMRMSI-H biomarker for their cancer drug, Gemberly.
Right, using those biomarkers to really target therapy.
Exactly. So for anyone listening, those biomarkers are basically indicators that help doctors decide whether a certain treatment is likely to be effective for a specific patient's cancer.
So much more targeted.
Yeah, so much more targeted.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about innovation, but what about the performance side of things? How are they doing there?
Well, the report really emphasizes how they've been consistently improving year after year in terms of how efficiently they operate, their profitability, and how much cash they generate.
That's music to any investor's ears.
It is, yeah. Steady progress is definitely a good thing.
Absolutely.
And they've actually upped their long-term sales forecast, now expecting to hit over 40 billion pounds in sales by 2031.
Wow, 40 billion.
That's a jump of 7 billion pounds from what they predicted just 4 years ago, so they're clearly feeling pretty confident.
They're bullish.
They're bullish. And a big part of that growth seems to be coming from their specialty medicines division, which contributed more than 80% of the group's total revenue increase.
So those innovative therapies we talked about earlier are really driving things.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to remember, they're managing a huge global supply chain, 37 manufacturing sites, churning out something like 1.7 billion packs of medicines and 409 million vaccine doses in 2024 alone.
That's mind-boggling.
It is. It's a massive operation.
And they're getting more efficient too, right?
Yeah, that seems to be a big focus for them, and it's actually leading to an improved gross profit margin, which is a key indicator of financial health.
Smart.
And they're also getting serious about sustainability in their supply chain. For example, they've got a solar farm and wind turbines at their antibiotic site in Irvine, Scotland.
Okay, so they're walking the walk.
Yeah, they're walking the walk.
Yeah.
And then there's their vaccine logistics hub in Belgium that's powered entirely by renewables.
Impressive.
It is impressive. So it seems like they're really trying to bake environmental responsibility right into their core operations.
Yeah, it's not just lip service.
Not just lip service, yeah. Okay, let's move on to the third pillar of their strategy, trust.
Trust.
Yeah. And this seems to cover a pretty broad range of things, everything from how they treat their employees to their impact on the world at large.
Yeah, internal and external.
Exactly. So internally, they reported an 81% employee engagement score in 2024, which they see as a sign of a positive workplace culture.
Happy employees, happy company.
Something like that, yeah. And they say that culture is all about accountability and good decision-making.
Makes sense.
Makes sense. Then externally, building trust is about things like making sure people can actually get the medicines they need.
Right. Access is key.
Absolutely. And they say they're committed to that through things like value-based pricing and partnerships in lower-income countries. They've actually set a target of reaching 1.3 billion people by 2030.
Ambitious.
Very ambitious.
Yeah.
And they're already making progress. They're supplying their RTS SAS001 malaria vaccine to a number of African countries.
A huge need there.
Huge need. And then there are their environmental goals for 2030 and 2045. Those are all about addressing their environmental impact across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And a good example of that is the new low-carbon propellant they're developing for their Ventolin inhalers.
Ventolin, the asthma inhalers.
Yeah. They say you could cut emissions by around 90%.
That's significant.
It is significant, yeah. Plus, they've already reduced their operational carbon emissions by 12% since 2023.
So they're making progress.
They are making progress, yeah. And let's not forget their work on inclusion and diversity. That's part of building trust, too.
Absolutely.
And that feeds into their responsible business performance rating that we talked about earlier.
Right, it all ties together.
It does all tie together.
Yep.
Okay, so we've covered their different business segments, their overall strategy, and some of their key initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's dive into the numbers, the financial highlights for 2024.
The fun part.
The fun part, okay. So they had total revenue of 31.4 billion pounds in 2024.
31.4 billion.
Yeah. And that's an 8% increase if you don't count their COVID-19 related sales, which were obviously much higher in the previous years.
Makes sense.
Makes sense, yeah. And as we've already discussed, oncology, HIV, and respiratory immunology were the big growth areas,
The stars of the show.
the stars of this show. Now, in terms of profitability, they highlighted an improved gross profit margin, which, like we said, is partly thanks to their efforts to be more efficient. But there was also that big 1.8 billion pound charge related to the Zantac settlements.
Right, that legal issue.
Yeah, so how did that affect their bottom line?
Well, it did have a big impact on their reported total earnings per share, or EPS.
EPS.
Yeah, that number dropped by 48% to 63.2 pence.
Ouch.
Ouch is right. But if you look at their core EPS, which basically strips out those one-off charges like the Zantac settlement, that actually went up by 3% to 159.3 pence.
So it's important to look at both numbers.
It is, yeah. The core EPS gives you a better sense of their ongoing performance.
Right, the underlying health of the business.
Exactly.
So what about cash flow?
They generated 7.9 billion pounds in cash from operations in 2024.
That's a lot of cash.
It is. It gives them a lot of flexibility to invest in R&D, pay dividends, and pursue other strategic opportunities.
Right, and we've already talked about how much they're investing in R&D.
Mm-hmm.
It's also worth mentioning that the increase in core non-controlling interests, or NCIs, was mainly due to higher profit allocations to their partner in VFAD Healthcare.
BV Health.
Yeah, that's their joint venture focused on HIV treatments.
Right. A very successful partnership.
Very successful. So, all in all, a solid financial performance in 2024 with strong underlying growth despite that Zantac hit.
Yeah, they weathered the storm.
They did.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about how GSK plans to reward its shareholders.
All right, the shareholder goodies.
The goodies. Okay. So
Yeah.
dividends are still a big part of that. They have this progressive dividend policy aiming to pay out 40-60% of their earnings through their investment cycle.
Mm-hmm.
For 2024, the total dividend per share was 61 pence.
61 pence.
Yeah, up from 58 pence in 2023.
A nice little bump.
A nice bump, yeah. And they're projecting another increase for 2025 to 64 pence per share.
So they're sharing the wealth.
They are sharing the wealth, but they also made another big move to boost shareholder value, right? They launched a share buyback program.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is.
A sign of confidence.
Yeah, the board basically said it shows how much they believe in GSK's medium and long-term growth prospects.
Mm-hmm.
And they also said it's a way to address what they see as the market undervaluing their shares.
Right. They think the stock is a bargain.
Yeah, so by buying back their own shares, they reduce the number of shares out there, which can bump up earnings per share and hopefully the share price too.
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand, yeah. But they did make it clear that their top priority for using their cash is still investing in the business itself,
Which makes sense.
especially in R&D, right?
Yeah, for a company like GSK, that's where the future lies.
Absolutely. So the buyback is more like a bonus on top of those core investments in innovation and growth.
A little something extra for the shareholders.
Exactly. Okay, so taking all of this into account, what's your overall assessment of GSK's business going forward based on what we've seen in this annual report?
Well, I think it's a pretty positive picture overall. They've raised their sales target to over 40 billion pounds by 2031.
Ambitious.
Ambitious, but it shows how much they believe in their growth potential. And they're really well positioned to achieve that growth. They've got the science, the technology, and the people to develop new and effective treatments.
And they're clearly focused on delivering value to their shareholders too.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the vaccine business is facing some challenges right now.
Mm-hmm.
But they do seem confident about the future there, especially with new approvals like Penmenvy coming through.
Right. They're not giving up on vaccines.
No, not at all. And the strong performance of their specialty medicines division is a really good sign for the future.
Yeah, that's their bread and butter.
It is. Plus, they're investing heavily in R&D, and their pipeline of new drugs looks promising.
So they're setting themselves up for success.
They are. So it all comes back to those three pillars we talked about: innovation, performance, and trust.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like they're really using those principles to navigate the ever-changing world of healthcare.
Yeah, a smart strategy.
A smart strategy. Well, I think we've really gotten a good understanding of GSK's current position and where they're headed, thanks to this deep dive into their 2024 annual report.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We've seen their commitment to R&D, their strong performance in key areas like oncology and HIV, their efforts to reward shareholders through dividends and buybacks, and an overall positive long-term outlook despite some bumps in the road with vaccines.
It's a complex business.
It is. It really highlights the dynamism and complexity of the global biopharmaceutical industry.
For sure.
And it makes you think about the balance between pushing the boundaries of pharmaceutical innovation and making sure those innovations are accessible to everyone who needs them all around the world.
Yeah, that's a big
A
question.
big question, and companies like GSK have a huge role to play in finding the answer.
Absolutely.
Well, here's a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
GSK has this ambitious sales target for 2031.
Right. 40 billion pounds.
40 billion pounds.
Yeah.
And the biopharma industry is constantly evolving.
Very dynamic.
It's very dynamic. So what do you think will be the most crucial factors in determining their success over the next few years? Will it be external forces like changes in regulations or breakthroughs from competitors, or will it be internal breakthroughs in their own research?
A tough one to call.
A tough one to call, but a fascinating question to think about.
Definitely.
And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into GSK.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. And thanks to everyone listening.